I thought that VR could be really helpful in just, inviting people to have this experience. And that was really how the company got started, where the VR part of our program puts users into the perspectives of people with different demographic identities and just really allows you to see what that's like from an inside point of view.
Hello, and welcome to episode 98 of the Living and Leading with Emotional Intelligence podcast. I'm your host, Brittney-Nichole. Today, I am coming to you from Sevilla, España, or Sevilla, Spain, so it may sound a little bit different for today's introduction. Today, you will be hearing from Dr. Robin Rosenberg. Dr. Robin Rosenberg is the CEO and founder of Live in Their World, a company built to help improve workplace culture utilizing a modern virtual reality method, which fully immerses an individual in workplace scenarios, teaching diversity, equity, and inclusion. This allows for open and honest conversation, which results in mutual understanding and respect among team members. With an MA and Ph.D. in psychology, Dr. Rosenberg is a passionate author of both college-level psychology textbooks and books for general audiences about the psychological underpinning of fictional characters and superheroes. Dr. Rosenberg is an assistant clinical professor at the University of California and has presented psychology classes at both Harvard University and Lesley University. It is a pleasure to introduce her today and bring her on the show. So without further ado, here is the conversation with Dr. Rosenberg. Thank you, Dr. Rosenberg, for joining me today. It is a pleasure to have you on the Living and Leading with Emotional Intelligence podcast. Before we begin, I would like for you to introduce yourself to our listeners. Who is Dr. Robin Rosenberg at her core? Who are you?
A great question. I have multiple identities, if you will. I'm a psychologist, I'm a wife, I'm a mother, I'm a grandmother, CEO of my company, Live in Their World. That probably your friend, sister. So these are different hats that I wear, and they're all, I think, integral parts of me.
Yeah, and you're in California, is that correct?
Not anymore, actually.
Not
with
anymore.
COVID, I ended up, long story, getting stuck in New York. And so I gave up my place in California. So I'm in New York full time.
Okay. Well, I'm really excited to speak with you today. As I briefly mentioned before we hit the record button, that I'm fascinated with the work that you've done around virtual reality, because we always talk about walking in other people's shoes. And this really gives people an opportunity to walk in other people's shoes, because it's one thing to try to come from that place of understanding, but to really experience that is something completely different, right? And that really ties into emotional intelligence as well. So how did you get into that work? And tell us a little bit about that, where it all started.
Sure. So I don't know, it's about 25 years ago, maybe even more, I learned hypnosis, how to do hypnosis in my work with patients. I was seeing many people who had eating disorders, and I could get the eating better, but body image, sort of lagged far behind. And it's, for many women, it's hard to feel good about your body in our culture. So I investigated hypnosis, which there were some data to suggest that was helpful. And so I got certified in hypnosis. And there started to be a very early literature on the psychology of virtual reality about 25 years ago. And I was fascinated because in hypnosis, there's a phenomenon called dual or divided consciousness, which is you hold the reality of what you're experiencing in trance alongside the reality of that you were sitting in my office, which is why some people think they're not hypnotized, because you're holding both. Mm-hmm. And I just thought this was intellectually fascinating. And then when I was reading about the psychology of VR, it was all lab-based back then. I mean, that's all there was. But it sounded like it gave you that same divided consciousness experience, which is what you're experiencing in a headset feels real, but you also know you're in a headset.
Yeah.
And in fact, neuroimaging studies subsequently have verified this, that what you experience in trance is registered by your brain is real, and what you experience in VR is registered by your brain is real. So that was a hunch that bore fruit.
Right.
And that's how I got interested in VR. And I just kept following the literature until it grew too big to follow. And so, yeah, that's the answer to that part of the question.
So I'm curious, when we talk about not being able to separate that artificial reality from that of reality, how do you see, there's a lot of talk about people that play video games, violent video games, and people argue, well, it's just a video game. Do you feel like, and I'm sure there's research out there, but I haven't looked into it, that people that play those violent video games tend to think differently? I know my husband plays them, but he is by far not a violent person. But, is there any data to suggest that that is not a positive thing to do? And does it even relate to what we talk about with virtual reality?
I'm not sure how much it relates. There have been many studies. There are a lot of data and what are called meta-analyses, where you look at all the data and you analyze them together to see what you find. And there have been a number of meta-analytic studies about video games and violent behavior. And it's just not clear, because you're trying to make a gross generalization about all people who have been studied who play video games. And so there may be a washout effect, which is it may nudge people in one direction, but only a subset of people. And so when you look at all, we don't know what it is about that subset. What subset is it?
There's so many nuances to that. Yeah.
There's so many what are called confounding variables. We have nuances. So I think it's a different question about VR. So the way that my company uses, in part, we have a program that uses virtual reality to address issues of bias and incivility in the workplace and upskill employees for respectful engagement. And that came about because while I was collaborating with a VR researcher at Stanford, Trayvon Martin was killed and George Martin was acquitted. And that led to Black Lives Matter. And that led some white people to tell journalists either, all lives matter or white lives matter. And not that I presume to know the lived experience of being Black, but from my work and readings, I thought I knew enough to hypothesize that it was really more of a profound failure of understanding that they said that they just really didn't know. And how could they know? And especially if they're not talking to people or reading or that kind of a thing. So I thought that VR could be really helpful in just inviting people to have this experience. And that was really how the company got started, where the VR part of our program puts users into the perspectives of people with different demographic identities, and just really allows you to see what that's like from an inside point of view.
I think that's wonderful. When you're doing these sessions with people in the workplace or wherever it may be, do you find that people that are is anybody really resistant to doing that? Like maybe they have a very strong bias and they go into it like, I really don't want to do this, but then they come out on the other side like, wow, I'm really glad I did that because it really opened my eyes to things. Because I see some people who are open to diversity and inclusion, and then there's other people who just really don't want to participate.
Right. So we actually don't call what we do diversity DEI training. We call it civility training, because fundamentally it's about unearned respect. just respect in the workplace. And none of us is ever going to get it all right.
Right.
We often don't get it right with the people we love the most. So how can we get it right with colleagues or people we may never have met in person? The idea is really just we all have our own lenses and our own things that are disrespectful, and just it's helpful to really know. So to know what those are and to be open to learning. I mean, that's the thing about the respect part, right? It's open to learning. If I know that something is disrespectful to you, I should go out of my way not to do it, or to do the respectful thing. Like that's kind of a no-brainer. And in today's work world, it's really a crucial ingredient for advancement or even retention. People really expect you to behave appropriately at work, if you will. So to answer your question that you started with about people who may not be particularly interested in DEI training, what the experiences we've had is that has opened people's eyes. People who didn't think they would be moved were moved. I should also say, though, that we believe in inclusion for everyone, not just everyone but white men, because that's exclusion.
Right,
And
exactly.
there is a story to be told for white men that I think just as white women have stories, just as Black men, Black women, Latino,
Right.
LGBTQ, people who have physical disabilities, as everyone has a story, it's really about being open to their story and learning from it.
Yeah. That got me to just envisioning a world where all of us, I don't know if you remember, I don't know why they faded out, but the Google glasses, I believe it was like Google
Yes.
came up with the glasses. Wouldn't it be fascinating if everybody could record their life and allow people to kind of step into their shoes and really see what their day-to-day is like, how that would really change how we think and interact with each other?
So it would be interesting, and my guess is that Microsoft or Facebook, as they're working on HoloLenses, that's probably in the near term be able to do that. I think the question you raised points to empathy fatigue, the possibility of empathy fatigue. If we are bombarded, instead of showing us your vacation photos, you're sort of, we're supposed to do the vacation VR experience, or just this is my life. At what point does it feel too much?
I definitely can see
not
that.
Really, we're not excited to take in and have someone else's experience. That's down the road. I don't think VR or mixed reality is there yet, but I do wonder about sort of how when it stops moving us in the same way, how much is too much.
I think that I totally get you with the empathy fatigue. However, we're living in this state of stress and anxiety and overwhelm and this social discord that we're facing where we're at each other's throats, so to speak. Do you think that, while empathy fatigue is not great, that it could kind of move us from one end of the spectrum where we lack that understanding and that anxiety and that outrage is what's fueling us, that lack of understanding, that it would kind of like move us towards a place where we don't have that hate and that rage and that outrage, but we kind of prevent from getting overwhelmed with that empathy? I think I would rather be overwhelmed with empathy than anxiety and hate and outrage, so to speak. What are your thoughts on that?
I think if as a society, we get to the point where we have empathy fatigue, that is problematic, because that's, empathy is a powerful motivator. I mean, that's actually why we use VR in part, right? Is to get people interested and willing to make the behavior change necessary to just develop new habits. I mean, we call them habits of respect or habits of inclusion.
Mm-hmm.
And VR motivates you. Oh, now I get it. Now I'm going to do that work to remember not interrupted meetings, or say confirm receipt if someone sends me an email and I'm not going to get to it for a day. So I think it's not a great place to be tapped out. I think that because of COVID, we're at this bizarre moment in time when I think many of us are really depleted and are tapped out, and it is hard to be empathic,
Mm-hmm.
not because of VR, but just because of the unending both real financial and safety implications, and then the anxiety and worry. And for parents, I mean, it's really been horrendous, except a couple of years, really, year and a half. So I think people are just emotionally depleted in general, and empathy is just one emotion.
Right. And I guess where I was going with that, so I'm kind of bringing my own personal perspective into the mix.
Mm-hmm.
So I used to be an extremely anxious person. I was diagnosed with OCD, GAD, and ADD. It was on all these medications, and it ran in my family, especially the anxiety piece. And I think so many people are on anti-anxiety medications or antidepressants.
Mm-hmm.
But what I discovered about 7 years ago, and why I started my business, Catalyst for Change, was that I realized instead of viewing that anxiety as a burden, really becoming curious and saying, where is this coming from? And kind of doing my own analysis there, but really becoming comfortable with being in that place and understanding it. And then when I realized that a lot of my thoughts were creating that anxiety because I wasn't living in the present, I was living in the past, bringing those experiences into the present, or worrying about things that hadn't happened yet in the future. Yeah. That I could control more than I thought, and I could control how I perceive the world around me. And I think so many people lack that understanding of that control of their reality. You can't control situations, but our reactions to those situations are 100% within our control. But that's hard for a lot of people to grasp because it takes a lot of work. It took 7 years for me to get here.
Got it. So it sounds like what you've somehow managed to do a lot of what we would call cognitive behavioral therapy for anxiety work on your own, including exposure, what's called, which is sort of learning to tolerate some of the uncomfortable physical experiences that go along with feeling anxious, that can themselves lead to greater levels of panic. But that you did a really nice job in learning to identify, become aware and master those, and sort of like the AA adage, learn what you could control and what you couldn't, and to focus on the things that you could and not worry about the things in the future that you couldn't control.
Yeah.
And that's lovely. My hat's off to you. I think when you were talking, I kept thinking about a toxic work environment. Where if you have a boss who's just really a piece of work, yes, you can work on shifting how you hear commands or frequent changes, or, if you're yelled at, which is totally inappropriate, but happens. You can learn to try to nudge your internal experience of it. But the reality is that that's a really bad situation. And there is an absolute limit to how much work can change your experience, if that makes sense.
Yes. I agree with you. And I think many people, so I think of the other extreme, like think of Buddhist monks, right? Nothing phases some of them. They've reached this level of enlightenment, so to speak, where they transcend the struggles and the sufferings, the emotional sufferings of the world that we've created. Yes. And when I think of that boss that would be yelling at me, what I think of is this has nothing to do with me. This has everything to do with that person. And a lot of people say that, but they don't believe that, right? They have heard people say, well, it's not me, it's them. But they don't necessarily believe that because they still are impacted by that boss yelling at them.
I guess I don't quite agree with you because I can believe that it's my boss, that my boss has all kinds of mental health issues or sort of personality issues. And when they yell at me, it's really, I mean, I can be 100% clear. They deny they told me to do something. I have the email thread that they told me to do it. And then they say, why did you do this? Right. I mean, I can 100% believe it, but still getting yelled at or, being lied to or sort of made to feel that my reality and the consensual reality that almost all of us have, someone questioning that is distressing. And it should be distressing. I mean, I guess, for a Buddhist monk, that is their full-time job, if you want to think of it that way, is to be working toward that spiritual place, and that has emotional consequences. But most of us have to do other things at the same, while living in the world. And it is, I mean, having a response when someone yells at you is actually a natural response and can be very informative. And so I'm not sure that becoming blasé about it because you've changed your experience is an appropriate thing to do. So I mean, I understand what you're saying. I mean, but I think that that's.
And I think that's where the difference is. People assume whenever I say that, I mean, just let it roll off the shoulders. Don't say anything, just grin and bear it, so to speak. But I don't mean that at all. I mean, definitely hold your ground, express yourself, let them know how that is coming across to you. The difference is how it impacts you is going to change. It makes it easier. What I've noticed is my reaction, my sympathetic nervous system does not become as engaged as it would have beforehand.
And so that's great. I mean, I'm not disagreeing with you about not getting your sympathetic nervous system engaged. I guess what I'm talking about, I really meant blasé, not grin and bear it. That's a different thing. That's getting your sympathetic nervous system. I'm talking about genuinely being, there it goes again, right? Of being just blasé about it, or but even the standing your ground, all of those things take mental work. And so, again, I'm, to the extent that this is something that happens frequently enough, that is not appropriate for the workplace. You should not have to do the mental work in the workplace to get yourself de-adrenalinized, or sort of, not get particularly adrenalinized when someone has been inappropriate at work. I mean, unfortunately, there are, companies, leaders, managers that allow people like that to continue in the workplace because they're high performers, or, whatever other reason. But I mean, there are a huge amount of studies. It really interferes with work. And I don't think that the solution is an individual one. It's a systemic one, I guess. So, because what you're saying, if I understand correctly, what you're saying is, well, if that's the work environment, each person should do the work, not to have it get to them. That's individual work that's maybe done collectively. And I guess what I'm saying is, no, I actually think that there shouldn't be work environments where that's okay.
Oh,
And
it shouldn't
instead
be
of,
okay. I 100% agree it shouldn't be okay. I think it needs to come from both ends. I think, yes, it is a systematic problem or a systemic problem, but that in and of itself is created by individuals, right? So I think
right,
if we do the work as an individual, but also as an organization, we don't allow that to happen. And I agree that with the society that we have, most people are not going to take that time or involve that energy or put that energy into that mental work because it is a lot. You have to get into that space where you have the energy to give, right? So I agree that you shouldn't have to deal with that in a workplace. I guess my question is, what do you find to be the solution? Because it's not just leadership that is reactive, right? I'm sure we've all been in teams where
yeah, totally,
individuals within the team are reactive. So,
right.
how do you light the candle on both ends, so to speak, in a good way, um, to light the fire both as a system, but also as an individual, right?
Got it. So I think it's a system level solution that has to be carried out by individuals, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Because ultimately all system level things or organizational level, right, it's really just depends on people doing what the organization says. So you know, on the one hand, it really is about organizations saying, this is costing us an enormous amount, especially in retention now, with the great quit.
Mm-hmm.
This is costing us in productivity. It costs 7.5 weeks a year of managers' time, just moderating conflict among people on their team. There are huge legal risk issues involved. This is costing us too much. And so there are many things that organizations can do to say, we really want to change this. And then it's up to individuals, leaders, managers, and individual contributors to say, this is what the company now expects of me. If my compensation is based on this, is my ability to get promoted is based on this, um, you know, I actually need to walk the walk,
Mm-hmm.
and they're going to point it out to me when I don't. And if I have enough anxiety issues that I go off on people when I get anxious because of my own deadline, that maybe I need to seek help, either coaching or therapy or counseling or something, um, so that I am less reactive in the workplace. Right. And maybe my boss says to me, hey, you seem to really, when we're under deadline, it seems like this is when you're more vulnerable. Maybe this is something you should think about. Right. So it is all of us together
Oh,
trying to do
100.
better,
Yeah.
but it is ultimately about the organization, what it rewards and what it gives a free pass on,
Mm.
as conveyed through the leadership's chain.
Yeah. How do you feel about, because you're talking about reward? When I work with organizations, I notice again, they talk about the same things that you do: retention, bottom line. These are our objectives. And they see things as a means to an end. And that is my only concern, is that they want to implement certain things, like, let's say, bring me in for emotional intelligence. Let's do a program on this. Bring leaders in, teach them how to be more emotionally intelligent. The problem is, if it is to get a promotion, if it is to keep their job, or as an organization, improve their bottom line, help with retention, et cetera, et cetera, I don't feel like people are truly embracing and embodying that change. It's more of a cloak of, I have to do this to get by. So it's almost of a tolerance of that behavior.
Right. And that's the difference between bringing someone in to do a check the box or bringing someone in to do real behavior change. real behavior change can't happen with a one and done, right? I mean, there's huge literature. I mean, again, our frame, my company, Live in Their World, our frame is we're ultimately talking about habit change. And that has to happen in manageable doses of information and learning over time with practice and feedback. And so you can tell off the bat if people want check the box or they want real behavior change simply based on the engagement. If they want you to come in and do a one-off talk, it's check the box. If people are saying, hey, this person needs coaching, let's do a 6-month engagement, with weekly meetings, they're talking about behavior change.
Right.
And if the person who's being coached, for instance, doesn't want to be there, but it's made clear your compensation is going to be based on this, and that they're either motivated or they're not, right? And that's going to tell their bosses something. So it takes care of itself as long as there's clarity around the communication. Does that?
Yeah, it does. That makes sense. And so do you use the virtual reality in all of these engagements as a tool to help engage them more? Or is it kind of, when do you decide to use that within your practice?
So it's a company, and we have the Live in Your World program is a subscription as a service program where organizations sign up for X number of tracks for their employees to experience over the course of a year. Because it's over the course of a year, it's in small doses, it's self-paced, they learn in different ways. And so the VR is one of 3 modules for each track. The methodology is the same for every track. So we'll put you in the perspective of a Black man and sort of see, in the VR module, it's experiencing what he experiences in a variety of scenes. But it's also seeing how, okay, so something yucky happened, now what? Right? And how every single person in that situation could make a difference. And so we're trying to upskill for 3 different positions. All of us will be in a work week. There's the person who was disrespected, the person who often unintentionally was disrespectful. Even, the toxic person is unintentionally toxic, although some people are intentionally toxic. And the bystander, who, if they understood what was going on, there are graceful ways to intervene. And so we're trying to help upskill all 3 perspectives, all 3 positions that will all be in a given work week, because there are 3 different sets of skills.
Right.
And then another module is the cognitive learning, it's an e-learning module that has video, and it really pulls out the more general principles so people can make it even clearer for take home. And we have explicit takeaway messages. We also assess what we do with every track. And so we get a baseline assessment and can measure change over time, because that's important to us. And the whole point is actual behavior change.
Right.
And that's the thing about building in new habits. So with the program, the VR is part of it. We also do leadership training workshops, not one and dones, because we won't do anything that's a one and done, except I give talks, because it's not effective. Right. Even incredibly engaging one and dones are just the effects figure out. So, but we have leadership training series of workshops where we may use there's a leadership track that's part of our program that we may use as part of the workshops to really help deepen the understanding. We also do executive coaching. And so we may, depending on why the person is being coached, bring in some of our basic program elements to facilitate the coaching.
How many people can you serve at once?
So the Live in the World program was actually made to be scalable. It's an unlimited number.
Okay.
It's low touch. So it was literally made to be for really large organizations or small, doesn't matter, because it's self-paced. Once we work with an organization to identify their needs, we understand what they're looking for. We have a schedule. for the year, what the deadlines are for the employees to have finished a given track. It kind of runs itself. And then the interesting thing is, because we were supposed to, it was the VR component was originally meant to be in an Oculus headset in the office, and then COVID hit. So we had to expand the ways that people could have the VR experience. So you can use your mobile phone and you put it in a what's called a mobile VR headset, which is a much better version of Google Cardboard from the old days, or what's called immersive video, which is on computer, where you don't need anything special. And that's like a YouTube 360 video for listeners who have had that experience.
You just answered my next question. That was exactly what I was going to ask you. Like, how do you guys, do you actually have a VR headset? Or so there's a variety of ways that
there are
you can
a variety
have
of ways people can have the VR experience depending on the organization and what they want, and they can leave it up to you, or I mean, really, it's very flexible, and it's meant to be.
And you're talking about, because I know your company works with organizations, but I think this is a beautiful thing for any of us to experience. Do you expand outside of organizations and allow anyone to potentially have that virtual experience? Like, if I myself wanted to have that experience, would I as an individual be able
We
to
don't
do
do direct to consumer,
Okay.
in part because we're really trying to upskill a system, right? It's really, really hard if you're an individual employee wanting to make a difference in the workplace. If you did some of our tracks, no one's going to know where you're coming from when you do things differently, right? Even if they notice, what we're trying to do is both the system and the individual. So we recommend, for instance, that teams be coordinated together for their start and stop dates, so that everybody knows where they're coming from as they begin to practice in real life with people. And it becomes water cooler conversation. So for our goals, it didn't make sense to do direct to consumer.
Okay.
That said, if we have individual coaching assignments, we will bring in, as it makes sense, some of the elements of our program. But for trying to really change workplace behavior, unless it's, again, there's an executive coaching issue, it doesn't really make sense to do direct to consumer.
I would love to hear some of the feedback that you've received from people that have just really had those life-changing experiences through this VR.
So again, it's not just VR, to be clear. The VR is one piece
of it, yes.
A piece of it. But I do know that in we initially did studies, some research for proof of concept data, because many DEI interventions that have been studied can create harm, that they can cause what we psychologists refer to as reactance, which is when you try to persuade someone of something, some percentage of people become more entrenched in their original position. It's called reactance. And that happens with DEI, which is part of why many DEI interventions are voluntary, because the concern is if you make it mandatory, you'll get reactance. So I wanted to make sure we weren't doing harm. And so we got amazing feedback, because I was right there, so I could hear, from people afterwards. One man took off the headset and he said, "Wow, my fiance was just telling me about this same dilemma last week, and I thought I understand, and I told her I understand, but I clearly didn't understand."
Yeah. Wow.
And actually, a woman, one who worked in one of the sites, wanted to experience. She was head of marketing, and I let her do it, and she started crying when she was in the headset, because that wasn't her experience in her current workplace, but that had been her experience in previous settings. And she was just so touched that we had created it so well. And then, there's one of the scenes in one of the tracks is about what it's like when a man comes to look at your computer. I don't know if you've had this experience while you're sitting and he's standing, and depending on how he's standing, his crotch is right in your face.
Oh, I've
Have you
never
had
had that
that?
before.
Oh, lucky you. But interestingly, apparently guys tend not to do that to guys. There's some like unconscious thing where they just don't stand that way. I don't know how they do it differently, but a number of guys have actually told us how incredibly impactful it was. And then, and so now what they do instead and what they, make sure, blah, blah, blah. So that's just some examples of things you think in your head, but really experiencing it is a different experience. It creates something else.
I can imagine. Yeah. I mean, I've had many moments in my life where I thought I understood something. And then until it happened to me, and obviously, even when it happened to me, there's still going to be that variation of my experience versus someone else's. But it's like, I get it now, right? You thought you got it, but it's like, oh, wow, I get it.
Right. I like to make the distinction. There's walking in your shoes, right? But that's really me walking in your shoes, right? So that's interesting to walk in your shoes, but my perception will be different than yours.
Exactly.
Right. I'll see what the world is through your eyes, but have my own perceptions. What we do is really walk in your feet and not in your shoes. The VR part of the program, actually the whole part of the program, is to really, this is what it is like. This is the way, someone from this demographic group may respond. But we're also really careful. You don't want to get into a stereotyping of, oh, well, now that I've seen the Black man track, I understand how all Black men respond. No, it's just a way of starting a conversation.
Right.
Of you may have a little more understanding, but each person, each Black man is unique and individual, and you have to treat each one that way and not make assumptions. It's a fine line between understanding the prototypical experience, but also wanting to learn each person's story, and not treat them as like, now I know, and this is what has been their story their whole life.
Very fascinating. So do you work with organizations all over the world? I know you said that. How does that work? Do people, if they want to do the program, and I know the VR is just a component of that, but do you provide that for them, or how does that work? So if an organization is hearing this.
Got it. For the VR piece, organizations can decide, I mean, COVID, they can decide any or all of three ways to have options. If they have people coming into the office, they would buy their own headset, Oculus headsets. We have, we would sort of give them, figure out, there's a developer app that they would upload into the headset. We have instructions for them. It's really easy. But they would administer that part in their office. They would schedule their own people in the little cubicle and handle that part. If they want people to do it in a mobile VR headset, we can give them information about different headsets. They can buy branded ones, they can buy their own branded Google Cardboard ones. We can give them information and they distribute them to their employees, or give
so it's just up to them, really,
and have them, each employee, order it on Amazon or go to Target or whatever they want, or no equipment, and they can leave it up to the employee.
Okay.
Right. It's really whatever an organization prefers, depending on their needs, and especially again with COVID and hybrid and remote employees. I think the old model of everyone comes to the office at some point isn't really realistic anymore.
So how small of an organization can actually utilize these services? Let's say that they only have a team of 10 people. Is there like a minimum number of people?
No, I mean, if 10 people is a good number, they're going to have a lot of contact with each other, those 10 people.
Yeah.
I mean, if that's what the organization is. And so, they may have as much need as, an organization that has 100,000, where they have so many different intersecting cross-functional teams that they're not on top of each other and in each other's lives so much, even remotely. So we're happy to work with whatever size team works, or organization works for people.
I
we
think
can do different things for large organizations, where if they're based in different parts of the country, they may choose a different order or different tracks, or we can accommodate that as well. So it's really whatever makes sense.
How many different tracks do you have, if you don't mind me asking?
Sure. We have 6 and another 6 that are in development, and then others planned for after that.
Okay. Awesome.
So it's plenty to get started.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for your time today.
Thanks so much for having me, and for great questions, and congrats to you about your 7-year journey.
Thank you. Still on it. It's never ending, but it's been a wonderful journey. And I will put all the information for your organization in the show notes. But if you also want to tell people right now, if anyone's listening and wants to just write it down themselves,
sure.
How can they find out about it?
So it's liveintheirworld.com. And we also have our own podcast called Their World, which you can find on our website, as well as Spotify and all those other places podcasts live. We have a lot of thought leadership. There's a tab on thought leadership, so feel free to look around there. On our publications page, we always have some free download, a white paper or an ebook or something. So feel free to look back periodically. I'm on LinkedIn. Just look Robin Rosenberg Psychologist, and Live in Their World is, of course, on LinkedIn and on Twitter.
I love it. Live in Their World. Well, thank you so much.
Thanks for having me. Thank you again, Brittney. Really appreciate it.
My pleasure.
Stay healthy.
You too.